Welcome to the place where we learn about and learn from the leaders in our field who are powering human creativity. I am Aaron Dworkin, and this is Arts Engines. Thanks again for joining me here on Arts Engines. Today's guest is Robert McGrath, who serves as Chief Operating Officer for the Cincinnati Symphony. Robert, welcome to the show.
Hi, Aaron. Real pleasure to be with you today.
So I'm really looking forward to our conversation, and obviously the Cincinnati Symphony is one of our wonderful partners, the creative partners with the show, help us to co-curate this show with, I think, a very important topic. And also, I just have to share that both because of geographical proximity and other partnerships with Sphinx, et cetera, I've had so many opportunities to see the extraordinary work and talent of the orchestra and many occasions, and it's just a wonderful orchestra, wonderful organization in a wonderful community. So thank you again for being on the show.
Yeah, thank you for hosting us.
Great. So collective bargaining agreements in orchestras. Let's delve into it. So this is something, and for any of our audience who may not be familiar, this is the overall structure that orchestras have with their musicians, right? Which kind of really outlines, how things are going to take place, et cetera. So I think before we get into kind of what you actually have negotiated, and in certain ways kind of how this is potentially groundbreaking, historic, really, could you just share with our audience overall kind of what are the types of things that are usually incorporated in a CBA, collective bargaining agreement, usually referred to as CBAs? What types of things are included in those? What do they tend to cover?
Yeah, well, most fundamentally, they cover terms for compensation and benefits for the orchestra. They also cover a whole host of what are often referred to as working rules. So these will be conditions that will cover everything from how many rehearsals or performances can occur in a given week, how long those particular rehearsals and concerts are typically referred to collectively as services in the industry. So they'll define how long any particular service can be. And in general, I would say they represent collectively as a field sort of an accumulation of best practices over time that balance what are the conditions that are going to allow the musicians of the orchestra to perform at their best and to have healthy, long careers, but also that balance the needs of the institution to increasingly push the envelope and find more and more opportunities to serve our community, maximize revenue, and things like that. So the agreement's a long balancing act of all those various factors.
Great. And of course, you're part of the administrative leadership of the orchestra as COO. Can you kind of just share then, so for our audience, who then do you negotiate with? Who is and how is that representation of orchestras? So there even may be some in our audience who don't understand about unionization of musicians, et cetera. So if you could just paint that kind of quick picture, that would be great.
Yeah, great. So all the members of the Cincinnati Symphony Orchestra and almost all professional orchestral musicians in the United States are part of the American Federation of Musicians. They, in the case of our orchestra, the musicians have a players committee that they elect on an annual, every other year basis. And the members of those committee, part of their responsibility is they're elected to serve as the negotiating party with the administration, the staff of the orchestra to negotiate for the terms of the collective bargaining agreement. The signatory to that agreement is always the president of Local 1. In our case, that person happens to also be a member of the Cincinnati Symphony Orchestra. That's not always the case. But so we negotiate jointly with the local union, who in turn represents the members of the orchestra.
Great, great. And I think kind of one just other framing type of question, so we kind of understand, is there a typical length that these agreements that are negotiated last for?
Yeah, that is a good question. They will range anywhere from 1 year to maybe on average up to 5 years would probably represent the typical outside parameter, with perhaps somewhere being in the middle being more of the average. The context of when one is negotiating and what is the economy like at that time, and what is the health of the organization will all play a critical part in determining, what are the mutual goals for what the length of the term should be. And in fact, that's one of the major things that has to be discussed at the outset of any negotiation, is how long of a contract are both parties even seeking.
Right, definitely. So, and of course, then all of these factors come into play, not the least of which are pandemics and financial downturns and inflation and all of these things that happen in the world, plus all of the things that actually happen in our arts world, can obviously go to affect these. And so you have, of course, very effectively completed this process that we've been describing earlier this year. And so can you kind of share what things really stand out in terms of this CBA that all our audience now knows, that you were able to negotiate with musicians? What makes it kind of stand out and in some ways really be historic?
Sure. Well, there's 3 primary accomplishments, I think, that we achieved in this particular negotiation. The first, which is probably the one area that's the most groundbreaking, would be that we have reframed the way that the work week itself is structured. So typically, most orchestras, their contracts are organized again around this concept of services, that there will be a fixed number of services in a given week. We now have a contract that allows us to organize the work week around the concept of hours. It sounds like a simple change, but frankly, just shifting the lens from services to hours opens up a tremendous amount of possibilities and thinking more creatively about how the work week is scheduled in ways that allow us to, most importantly, which is why we were seeking this framework, to be adaptive to the conditions both during and emerging from the pandemic, particularly given the need to be, I think, more adaptive to shifting audience preferences in the future. Second is that we've created a whole new suite of tools and incentives that allow for individual members of the orchestra to work in small ensembles in ways that really activate and maximize that expand their ability to serve our community engagement and education programs, and maybe most importantly, to do it in a way that adds impact and relevance to that programming. And then the third is in the area of DE&I. We even before the pandemic, we had ad hoc working groups amongst the staff, the orchestra, the board, that were working on a host of, an across the board analysis and evaluation of the organization's recruiting, hiring, employment practices. And based upon our positive track record of working together, we were able to formalize that group, make it a standing committee of the orchestra that's specifically tasked with working with the administration on a regular basis, nearly monthly basis, in fact, to continue that work. And they've been empowered to make recommendations in real time to the musicians of the orchestra, such that if there are changes that we all agree upon that require adjustments to the CBA, we don't have to wait another 3 years to actually effectuate those. We have the ability to go and seek those adjustments in real time.
Awesome. So fantastic. And I think one of the things is, as I think about the field, oftentimes people will seem to say in orchestras, well, if it's not enshrined in the CBA, it's not necessarily, something permanent for the orchestra. And so seeing things like the DE&I work and the I guess kind of reflection of its importance as something systemic within the institution to be addressed, seeing that enshrined in a CBA, valued in that way, I think is so wonderful, because now that's the administration and the musicians who are jointly committing to these issues. It really is fantastic. And also kind of, it sounds like what almost has kind of been enshrined is in effect flexibility, that kind of cuts through multiple things that you shared, this ability to respond to changing times, to audiences, audience preferences, digital platform probably work, things like that. And obviously community engagement, that this just provides for flexibility, both for the musicians as well as for administration. Is that an underlying?
I think that is a great point. In fact, that is, if there was one sort of buzzword that was often repeated at the negotiating table, it was flexibility. And in our case, we had an agreement that expired at the end of the 1920 season, so really at the onset of the pandemic. So our current agreement is a 3-year contract that began this season, but we actually negotiated a precursor to this agreement, which covered that initial pandemic season. And a lot of the ideas that we have carried forward were actually experiments that we really quickly mutually agreed upon as tools that would be necessary to respond to an environment where we didn't even know how could we perform, how many people could get together, and what size of audience would we be able to have. And so the flexibility that we needed from that, we lived with it for a year. So that was also an important point, that we lived in real time with this. We're able to sort of mutually demonstrate the value of some of this flexibility, and that made it possible, and I think, for us to quickly at the table to come to an agreement about the value of extending some of these permissions moving forward. And I can certainly give you some real world practical examples of how some of this flexibility manifests in a real season. But
no, absolutely. Is there one, maybe just one example you could share of kind of, so people get that sense of what happens in the real world?
Maybe if I had to pick one example, I'd pick this shift in the contract allows us to take the work week and either do performances that could be longer, to do performances that could be shorter and more frequent, and to even just accommodate more capacity in any given work week. So the top example would probably be film programs. I think they function a little bit like operas. I think many orchestras increasingly will have film programming, live accompaniment with the orchestra for film as a regular part of their season, as we do in Cincinnati. And those could range anywhere from 2.5 to even 3 hours plus with an intermission. Under the old rules, those would be predetermined, sort of fixed units of time that, if it exceeded a certain amount of time, would automatically trigger overtime payments for the orchestra. Under this parameter, there is almost no scenario where any film program would trigger that sort of overtime threshold for the CSO, as long as we're looking holistically at the course of the week. And if we're going to have a 3-hour film, for instance, that we're sensitively balancing the rehearsal schedule and other activity over the course of the week to make sure that we don't exceed a fixed number of hours, in our case 20 hours. So it's just one small example, but it makes things more cost effective and beneficial for the organization with those important programs.
Absolutely. And it's so funny too, because for people outside of the field, it also is kind of addressing those things of where people be like, well, why can't they do that film project? Or, and they're like, that makes no sense. Why can't they just have that flexibility? And of course, it's because of sometimes these underlying issues. And so to have that flexibility built in, I think is wonderful. The one just additional question I had with it, just I've noticed that sometimes when these, agreements are negotiated, sometimes they end and all sides feel really great about them and are excited moving forward. sometimes there can be a relatively laborious process, and either or both sides don't feel so great kind of coming out of them. Just kind of curious, how was that process for you, and how kind of did, as sometimes people say, administration and the musicians, how did both sides come out of the process feeling?
I think feeling like our bond is even stronger than ever. None of this was possible without having a very strong organizational culture going into the pandemic. Frankly, in the case of Cincinnati, this is a decades-long culture of real mutual solution seeking amongst all of the stakeholders, with the orchestra, the staff, the board. So I inherited an incredible culture. I think everybody who comes to work for the Cincinnati Symphony Orchestra considers it a real critical aspect of their job and responsibility to ensure that we continue to foster that and only improve it. So it sounds a little perverse in some ways, because obviously the pandemic was incredibly tragic for our society collectively and put immense challenges on the arts. But here in Cincinnati, I believe that the way that we were able to almost immediately coalesce with the musicians of the orchestra around the desire to continue to performing, to find ways that we could do so responsibly and safely, to continue to serve our community, and in so doing have to learn to adapt with digital content, with leaning into and accelerating our work in the areas of DE&I that had begun even before the pandemic. There's a lot of accomplishments that I think we're proud of, but the one I think that's the most is that because we were able to do all of that in spite of and during the pandemic, I think we're even stronger. And all that adaptability that we've learned, coupled with the culture, I feel encouraged and optimistic about our ability to deal with now this unprecedented environment that we find ourselves in coming out of the late stages of a pandemic.
Totally. Well, unfortunately, we are just about out of time, but I always like to ask of all my guests, there's got to be times that are challenging. Sometimes our obstacles seem insurmountable. That can certainly happen in any negotiating process. And just curious, as a leader, as especially an arts administrative leader, during times of challenge, where do you draw upon for insight, for inspiration, for strength when it seems like times are really tough?
Good question. Two things come immediately to mind. One is still the music itself. I consider myself incredibly blessed and fortunate to work in a field where it's part of my job to actually listen to performances every day, and almost without exception, no matter what's happening behind the scenes, when I'm able to be in that audience, listening to our incredible musicians perform music by incredible composers and with incredible performers and collaborators, that refreshes my soul. And the other answer is I've rediscovered lately that I need to reconnect with quietude. Something as simple as I drive home now and I divorce myself from listening to podcasts or radio or something, and I've discovered that it may be something we all knew in the 1990s before we were inundated with all this technology and constant noise, like just finding 30 minutes to myself to just do nothing but think while I'm commuting makes the brain, like the synapses, fire in ways that I'm actually intentional about doing that now, because it just happened by accident. And I just sort of reacquainted myself with the value of being with one's own thoughts occasionally.
I absolutely love that, and often difficult in this modern age. Robert McGrath, you truly are one of the arts engines who is powering human creativity in our world. Thank you so much for being on the show.
Thank you, Aaron. A true pleasure.